Thank you. My question is, why were Catholic nations in the past theocratic, and why were they not theonomous?
Well, the answer is going to depend on how you define the terms theonomy and theocracy. The term theocracy was originally introduced by Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century. And what he meant by it was a conviction that Jewish people in his day had, that God was the ultimate ruler of their nation. And, there could be local earthly rulers like, the king, like King Herod, or Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. But ultimately, it was God who was behind the authority of the rulers, and ultimately God was in charge. And some people viewed that as consistent with having these earthly rulers. Other people thought, no, at least the pagan rulers don't really represent God. So there was some dispute on that point. But the fundamental conviction is for many Jewish theocrats was that God is ultimately in charge of the nation, even if he's using earthly rulers like, let's say, a Jewish king, like King David or someone to rule on his behalf. Theonomy is a recent term that developed in the, I guess, mid-20th century. And the idea is that the law of God, the nomos of God, should be applied in nations today. So theonomy is a combination of nomos and theos, meaning God's law. And so the idea is that we ought to apply God's law as expressed in the Old Testament to modern society with a few modifications. We don't need to keep kosher. We don't need to sacrifice the Passover lamb. But according to theonomists, which are a particular group in conservative Protestantism, we should take the Jewish laws from the Old Testament and apply them to modern society to the extent that they are not revised by the New Testament. And so it's more of a particular position that one could take regarding what the law should be, but it doesn't necessarily mandate a particular governmental system. So you could have theonomists who support a democratic republic, for example. They just think that the laws that democratic republic should enact should be based on Old Testament law. So with those meanings of the two terms in mind, Catholic nations historically have not been theonomic because the Catholic Church does not believe that every aspect of the Mosaic law should be applied to society today. The moral law should be, but that doesn't mean that you need to, for example, set up cities of refuge where people who've committed homicide can flee to be protected from the avenger of blood within a particular tribe, because European society was not based in the Christian era on tribes that had avengers of blood who were obligated to hunt down people who had committed homicide and try to kill them. So the Catholic Church historically has not had theonomic nations. When it comes to theocratic nations, well, okay, in Josephus's view, you could say that a lot of Catholic nations were theocratic and that they believed that God was ultimately in charge. He had civil rulers here on earth like kings who reigned on God's behalf, but ultimately God was in charge of everything and was guiding the destinies of these nations. But that's not the only meaning of the term theocracy. Josephus's meaning is where the term started, but it's also been understood in other ways, such as meaning rule by religious authorities, such as rule by priests. And there have been nations in the history of the world that were theocratic in that sense. And a classic example would be ancient Egypt, because the pharaoh was regarded as a religious figure. He not only was a king, he was also the high priest of Egypt, and he was even regarded as a god himself. So that was a kind of theocracy that has never existed in Christian circles. There have been some Christian nations locally that could be theocratic in the sense that they did have religious rulers. The example of that comes to mind would be the Papal States, where because the civil authorities broke down in parts of Italy and so forth, the popes kind of stepped into the vacuum to keep things going in society. And so you did have the pope as the head of some areas in the Italian peninsula, for example. Those were called the Papal States. But that's not a required form of government in Catholicism, because the church recognizes there is a role for civil authorities distinct from church authorities. So that's kind of an overview that I hope gives you kind of, Sergio, the conceptual tools you need to have to think through these issues. I'm afraid, though, I could say more, but I'm afraid we're going to need to move on, because we're about to come to our mid-hour break.